Hello, this is an audio essay by Eduardo Alonso C. The title for this audio essay is The Importance of Role Models and Representation, Redefining Gender through Personality Appropriation. So, we're going to start off by elaborating on what I mean by personality appropriation. What I mean by personality appropriation is that when you project yourself to a role model, precisely you're following a person or someone, either real or fictitious, that you feel that they have something either skill-wise or physique-wise that you want to be better at. So you project yourself to this person, either fictitious or real, and you start appropriating parts of their personality into your own personality. And then slowly, little by little, you start building your own personality as you grow up. So that's the idea of personality appropriation. And is a really basic idea, mostly taken from Judith Butler's Performative acts idea, which she states that as a public action and performative act, gender is not a radical choice or project that reflects a merely individual choice, but neither is it imposed or inscribed upon the individual, as some post-structuralist displacements of the subject would contend. The body is not passively scripted with cultural codes as if it were a lifeless recipient of wholly pre-giving cultural relations, but neither do embodied selves pre-exist the cultural conventions which essentially signify bodies. Actors are always already on the stage within the terms of the performance, just as a script may be enacted in various ways, and just as a play requires both text and interpretation, so the gendered body acts its part in a culturally restricted corporeal space and enacts interpretations within the confines of already existing directives. This basically means that gender and personality are built by repeating acts that the subject has previously seen either in history or in the media, and repeats those acts over and over and over till it becomes part of their personality and their gender. Taking these ideas, I decided to make a couple of interviews, 5 in total, each and every one of them with 3 parts to the interview. The first part, we were discussing this idea of personality appropriation in an educational system where one individual in a learning environment takes a role model, either the teacher or from history. The second part, we discussed the political spectrum, how we can find role models in politics and the importance of representation in politics. And the third part, we discussed the media and how representation in the media can help one construct their own gender and help development of a personality and gender, as well as the importance of representation in media. Then the interviews were concluded with one final question to the interviewee, which was what was their hopes for the future. And that's how this audio essay is also going to be concluded. We're going to be concluding with ideas of what we hope for the future. What I personally hope for the future. Starting off with the first part of what the interviews were, the educational system. The first part, the first question we did on that first part was essentially explaining what a role model is and explaining a little bit about what a role model is and what kind of lessons someone could get from these role models from an individual or children. Given this question, some of my interviewees had interesting answers to them. One in particular, she actually said,
I think if they look up to their educators, then they're more willing to, I think, be educated or to associate, I think, like positive sorts of experiences and feelings with learning. So I think then that would continue on into adult living, right? This sort of love of learning and this excitement about learning and this engagement with learning.
What she means by this is that at a young age we start to already copy and start to relate to those who give us lessons and whatnot. And if we engage in a positive way with a teacher or the adult that is teaching us, we start to associate positive reactions to learning, and that engagement to learning, we take it into adulthood, and then we have a more open mind into learning different stuff. So we want to learn more, and that openness and that open-mindedness of learning everything we see, everything we interact with, help us understand someone else better, because we want to learn from them. We want to learn from their culture. We want to learn from their gender. We don't close off to them because we don't understand them. We try to understand them, and I think I do think this is a positive thing to take over on to adulthood, because then as you grow up and your beliefs get challenged constantly, instead of closing off and be conservative about your beliefs and be like, oh no, I don't want to know anything about that, you start learning. You open up to, okay, why does this person disagree with me, and you start to try to learn their side of the story, and therefore you get a more better understanding of what they're doing, of what they live with, not what they're doing, what they live with. Another thing to consider as well is this need to differentiate between what's important on a role model and what's not. Like what my other interviewee said to me.
And I think it's important that they have role models of every type, so that they see that the physical part is not that important, and the inside part is not all important, but what you are aiming at, the voice is the role model, the strength to survive, the ideology of a dreamer, what is the important part, but not the rest of the not the physical part that you see of the person.
She means that you don't necessarily follow someone because you want to look like them. You follow someone because you find something in their ideology, in their way of living, that you feel it's the ideal you. So you start following them in order to get to that. You start to imitate them. You start to appropriate that personality, so you can start trying to achieve the same level, the same ideal level of spirituality, in a way, if you like, or happiness or intelligence, whatever you're trying to get better at. And then she also brought this idea of having not just one role model but many different role models. What she means by that is that you have different examples, different representative examples of different ways of living, of different ways to be a person. Like, if you have a variety of examples, you can pick and choose from them and start constructing your own ideas, your own personality and your own gender from these different representations that you see in education. So, bringing back what Judith Butler said about the performative act and how and how gender is constructed through it, I started to ask as well how more representation could benefit a child in defining their own gender by these repetitions. So basically, with this question, I brought up the idea that, was previously mentioned by one of my interviewees, that of many representations all over the place. The more role models in an educational system, I believe, could actually benefit a kid to be better understood, to feel that it has a place it belongs, or someone he can talk to about their own problems as they start to discover their gender and personality. One of the interviewees actually mentions something to that point where representation is important, because
I grew up in this place where, like I was, because I'm half Latino in Italy, so it's kind of, everybody was white there, even though it's not like Anglo-Saxon, still white. So I was the blackest thing around there. Even though I'm pale white, my hair was black, and so like you still see the difference. And as role models, and I was missing that a lot. I was always missing like someone that I could identify myself with. You know what I mean? Like someone that like didn't, someone you need someone that like you recognize yourself with, because you're gonna look for it like left or right, and it's better to find there sooner, because otherwise you're gonna get lost. And I've been lost for many years, and I've been lonely a lot. I started elementary school like in Italy, a 6-year-old, right? It took me like good 14 years that I started dancing reggaeton and stuff like that, like drinking tequila in the bars. So you find out eventually, but it's better if you find it earlier, someone that like, that you can identify yourself with. I'm seeing this like more in a cultural way, but I guess it applies for sexual too.
It's precisely this feeling of being lost that can actually affect a child negatively, and it can actually make it more depressed in later years, and it can be very destructive to the individual. So a way I believe that can be this can be avoided is if there's more representation in school, in a friendly environment where the child always is. So he said in this interview, he can find his own space early on instead of having to wait so long to find it later on. Yes, he meant it in a cultural way, but it also applies for personality appropriation and gender construction. This gender construction can also be affected by the adults or teachers that are teaching to this individual. The individual could see their own teacher as a role model or someone they can communicate with. So can it affect their gender construction? I ask these questions around. So one of my youngest interviewees actually said,
like, if you're different, they aren't like telling you like you should do this to be like the other ones, or like the ones like aren't different to be like the other ones. Like they aren't like that. Like if you have problems or like that, the adults try to like they help you, but they don't like go for a side or
So like, so in your experience, your teachers tend to be neutral about it.
Yes, they're neutral on that.
So do you think that's a good thing? Do you think that would help a child understand themselves better?
Yes, because I think if you're like equal with everyone, they will feel like safe, like not safe, like confident on themselves.
Okay.
They won't be suffering or not suffering. They won't feel different with everyone. They will fit with everyone else. They won't be discriminated and not treat them different. Just treat them equal, same as everyone else.
What she's talking about here in this part is normalization of behavior in a teaching environment. So if you don't treat one differently than the other, you start to normalize it, and that can be positive for the individual. Not just for a child, but also for a young adult going into college, for example. But it's not necessarily a good thing, as my next interviewee will discuss, because...
I think a lot of gender is a really strange thing because it's, there is so much, binary, so much of the world just still operates in very, male-female roles. And so, the existence of, a queer presence or, a non-binary presence in, instructors is something that is very foreign to me. Yeah, I feel like a non-binary presence in, instructors is something that's, is hard for me to imagine or understand.
So, because of a lack of acknowledging these binaries or differences, actually made them feel isolated in a way. So for them, it's really hard to imagine this kind of representation in a teacher, for example. That is the flip side to this neutral approach, because you don't necessarily find someone to identify with that early on. And we go back to what happened previously, where the individual feels lost and starts to get depressed, starts to have a really negative impact on them. This reminds me of a quote from Audre Lorde, which I actually took into consideration, which says, "In a world of possibility for us all, our personal vision helped lay the groundwork for political action. The failure of academic feminists to recognize difference as a crucial strength is a failure to reach beyond the first patriarchal lesson. In our world, divide and conquer must become define and empower." She says this in the context of poor women and women of color and that of white feminists, which they clearly have a difference in upbringing. So they have they have a difference in opinion about the values of the movement, and instead of trying to say that they are all the same or that there's no difference, they should acknowledge those differences, because those differences can actually strengthen their bond and make them stronger overall. With this quote, I segued into the political spectrum and started to do questions about representation in politics to my interviewees, which I asked them using this quote how important it is today with recent rise of political strands. How important is it in the context of a xenophobic government to realize that difference is not a weakness but a strength, and is looking for more representation a way to do this? This is a double-edged sword, because in politics there's always two sides to it, and this rang true with the answers some of my interviews gave me, where they were all about representation, but some of them pointed out that there's another side to this, that it could actually affect in a negative way, because, like the saying goes, one voice doesn't represent all of them, like this interviewee said.
That's a tough one. I honestly, I'm not sure. I can't say that I have real clear thoughts about that. On one hand, again, yes, representation is very important, but I think sort of overall is looking for more representation and role models, way to do this. I think overall, yes. But it has to be self-representation rather than being represented through the eyes of another, if that makes sense. So if we're seeing more representation in media, let's say, then I think it's important that the representation comes from the group that's being represented, rather than from, say, an outside group, or like from the kind of current power paradigm, sort of wanting to sort of represent other groups, again, quote unquote. I think that's dangerous, because I think then what that is just the culture industry sort of expanding its buying base, like its buyer base, if that makes sense, right?
Here she's talking in the context of media and advertisement, but this also can be applied in the political, if we think of buying base as voting base. So a politician could try to talk about, could try to bring the voice of a minority in place. They could be like trying to represent a minority by promising better payment for them, better treatment for them, and yada yada yada. But it doesn't necessarily represent one aspect of that minority, and they're just doing it to get more vote counts for their favor and get a better chance of being elected. She then later on continued with this, saying,
and like RuPaul's Drag Race is kind of maybe the most, like the starkest example I can think of. Like drag is now becoming a much more mainstream and more like sort of normative, digestible kind of mode of seeing and viewing, right? Whereas again, like 20 years ago, it would have been a lot more underground. But, with the case of something like RuPaul's Drag Race, which is heavily produced, what ends up happening is there's all these drag queens that sort of fit into that narrow standard of female beauty, right? So it's on one hand it's reaching a broader audience, but on another hand it's sort of conforming to the same rules, in a slightly different kind of iteration.
Yeah.
So I think representation is absolutely essential, but I think it has to. Be democratic. I think because in any subgroup, you get a whole variety, right? You can't have one voice for a whole, faction of society, right? And because there's of course division and difference within every group, right? Even if it's a subgroup that so yeah, I think representation, self-representation is important.
Again, she's talking in the context of media to exemplify what she means in politics, but what essentially boils down to is that with representation in politics, you have the risk that the spotlight in politics is given to one minor aspect of a minority, and all of a sudden that aspect of that minority becomes the whole general aspect of it, instead of just being either an exception or just one tiny bit of what it is. So in a way, this representation can actually misrepresent the minority is supposed to represent in the first place. And the solution here would be to have more variety, not just one voice, but have many voices of that minority. Like, if you only have one queer politician or senator in the consulate, then it doesn't necessarily represent the whole queer community. It could probably just represent one small aspect, one little part of that community, and then you have the rest of the community feeling left out and misrepresented. But on the flip side, if you have more than one queer senator in the consulate, or more than one queer representative in the consulate, then a larger portion of that community will actually feel represented. This doesn't fix everything. There's still gonna be people that are gonna feel misrepresented. no matter how many representatives of the community are in the consulate. But it is a way to move to a better place, I think. And it could actually help diversify the representation of that community instead of just single out one small population of the community. Having discussed all of this with my interviewees, I moved on to the next question, which was, with more representation of gender and sexual orientation in politics, would this actually help her reconsider previous prejudice and redefine gender and sex in society in a social norm? So all the social rules that we have right now, all the stigmas that we have about gender and sexuality, if there's more representation in politics, could we actually could society as a whole redefine the prejudice and start taking out outdated ideas? Again, this is a complicated one because of the previously mentioned rise of strains in United States politics. The people I interviewed actually believe that it can help, but some of them actually pointed out that it might take a while, and right now it's not an instant fix, for example.
The country is more divided than ever. I don't think that it's his fault directly. I don't know about like American politics, but like, it's a close example that I can do, right? But there's been the opposite effect, because like sometimes, how you can feel to some people, like you want to put something in your fucking face. No, you gotta do this now. Because honestly, like, I hate politically correct too. Not because it's just like it's a way of saying. It's because a lot of time you feel that like you cannot say some things. You cannot behave a certain way. You cannot like express yourself, which I understand. Okay, because I wouldn't want anybody like come in my face and say the N-word all the time. It's annoying, right? But a lot of times it's like you're imposing a lot to people that like they wanna be, dude, chill out, you know what I mean? And you act like an elitist. And when people they feel that like they're always, that they're always kind of like told not to do something, you gotta snap eventually.
What he's saying is that it's human nature to react in a negative way when our beliefs are challenged without engaging us in a conversation. Like if we're constantly said that what we're saying is wrong, and they don't engage us in the conversation, they just say you're wrong and move on. So being that the case, he says that maybe the way globalization has been tackled hasn't been the best one, because a lot of people feel their opinions are being censored just because it's not the popular opinion, and so they feel oppressed, although it's not necessarily the case that they're actually oppressed, as he later on said.
I lived in USA for like 5 years, and I have so many friends and family there that I know their complaints. First, they told me. Second of all, I can see them from their face, right? Like, they feel forced. They feel oppressed. Which is weird to say because they're not. But you're talking about people that, like, they never been oppressed before. So, like, even though, like, they say bullshit, it's their bullshit and they have the right to say it. So even if you say, hey, be more polite, like, they feel oppressed.
And it's not only this problem he mentions. There's also this other issue about peer pressure and capitalist ideas that are part of the culture, as he later on continues.
Everything is fashion too, right? A lot of people that like, they just want to be like politically correct because it's cool. Because a lot of times, like, I hear people that like telling me that like I shouldn't use bad words when I talk, without if you want to be really correct, you will understand that like I have an accent because English is not my first language; it's actually my third. So if you want to be really politically correct, you will accept my difference as this is my form of expression because I have my limitations. But no, you just stop to shutting people. So far, globalization has been proven to be kind of weird. It's not been working so far. It's been forced.
And with this last answer he just gave, it's a good way to segue into the second part, into the last question of the second part, which I took a quote from the same Audre Lorde who said to change the idea of divide and conquer to that of define and empower, which says, women of today are still being called upon to stretch across the gap of male ignorance and to educate men as to our existence and our needs. This is an old and primary tool of all oppressors to keep the oppressed occupied with the master's concerns. Now we hear that it is the task of women of color to educate white women, in the face of tremendous resistance, as to our existence, our differences, our relative roles in our joint survival. This is a diversion of energies and a tragic repetition of racist patriarchal thought. What she means by this is that a way for the oppressor to maintain power is to distract the others by making them try to explain their needs to them while they just ignore them or don't give any effort into trying to teach themselves the problems of the other populace. Taking this into consideration, the question I ask is, does more representation actually help? Or does it actually make it so politicians have an excuse to not put any effort into learning the needs of the populace or the minorities that are misrepresented in government? This thought might be true, but it also has a flip side where it actually brings a positive side effect, let's say, one of the people I interviewed explains this the best.
I think that it kind of depends on the space of the opposition, I guess. So if there's more representation, there's naturally there's going to be people who would use that excuse of like, oh, well, now there's people who can deal with this, and so I don't need to. Especially in like political systems, like I could see maybe existing members deciding that because there's representation, like they no longer need to have an opinion on the matter, or like maybe even would oppose opinions based on like the minority groups that are represented. But then I think that also more representation would, in others, maybe like just like perpetuate like kind of ally, like the space of the ally. And I think that that's something that's really important as well, that is often ignored, is like the space of allies and the space of people who are fighting for equality, who maybe like don't necessarily fit into minority groups or don't necessarily have the same like kind of like number of like tallies on their like minority group like cue card or whatever. Like I feel like, yeah, the space of the ally is something that would maybe benefit from more representation.
So on one side, that thought that Audre Lorde's quote brought up might be a possible result of this search for representation, but on the other side, it could actually bring to the spotlight the people that are considered allies, and these minorities can actually go to them and maybe start getting a better representation through those allies. And that was the last question in for the political spectrum and the importance of representation in politics. After that, we went back to personality appropriation, but this time with media. This is the third part of the interviews that I made, all about representation in media and how that affects gender construction. For it, we went back to Judith Butler for the first question, this time pulling a different quote from the same essay, which goes as follows. It seems clear that although theatrical performances can meet political censorship and scathing criticism, Gender performances in non-theatrical contexts are governed by more clearly punitive and regulatory social conventions. Indeed, the sight of a transvestite on stage can compel pleasure and applause, while the sight of the same transvestite on the seat next to us on the bus can compel fear, rage, even violence. The conventions which mediate proximity and identification in these two instances are clearly quite different. I want to make two different kinds of claims regarding this tentative distinction. In theater, one can say this is just an act and derealize the act, make acting into something quite distinct from what is real. Because of this distinction, one can maintain one's sense of reality in the face of this temporary challenge to our existing ontological assumptions about gender arrangements. The various conventions which announce that this is only a play allow strict line to be drawn between the performance and life. On the street or in the bus, the act becomes dangerous, if it does, precisely because there are no theatrical conventions to delimit the purely imaginary character of the act. Indeed, on the street or in the bus, there is no presumption that the act is distinct from a reality. The disquieting effect of the act is that there are no conventions that facilitate making the separation. What Judith Butler means by this is that if we see a performance as just that, a performance, we get this safety blanket, this barrier that protects our sense of reality in the face of this temporary challenge to it. And it's precisely that, it's a temporary challenge. It's not a constant challenge to our reality, so we can accept its presence in front of us and we can even enjoy it if it's a comedy or a drama. But the moment we go outside, this barrier gets erased. We don't have this barrier, and we have to face this challenge to our reality constantly every day with discourses that talk about this challenge to our reality, or by what we witness in front of us in real life. But is it true of all media that this happens, this blanket that protects one's reality? Is it true of all media that it doesn't change one's reality at all? What about normalization of gender in TV and film? Do they pass through the reality barrier in a way? Same for music and radio? This is the question I brought to the people I interviewed, and some of them had interesting answers to give. For example,
certainly media is powerful and it exerts a great deal of influence over our lives. And if we, I think that it's problematic when dominant modes represent or normalize sexism or homophobia, transphobia, discrimination of any kind. And, like hip hop, I'm looking at you. And you can't, of course, paint right? You can't paint with one broad stroke, as the saying goes. But, when you have the capacity to influence a great number, I think, like who said, with great power comes great responsibility, something like that, right? Mm-hmm. So if you have the ability to reach out and to influence a lot of people, then I think you also have a responsibility to represent in an ethical kind of way. And I think a lot of the dominant modes of media are not. They don't represent ethically. You know what I mean? Sexism abounds, racism abounds, stereotyping, homophobia, transphobia. It's getting better. I will say that because, we are hearing about transgender directors, actors, who are making careers for themselves, and being proudly, vocally, transgendered. So yeah, it's changing. But yeah, I mean, media is tremendously impactful. And how we orient ourselves in what media, what we're exposed to, and, I think really has a strong effect on who we become and our worldview, I was raised by hippies. So I was exposed to a lot of like alternative cinema, music, like real alt kind of at the time, so for me the ideas of, I don't know, it's not that hard, like it's a bit more like, well, yeah, this is how things are. But I think for someone, again, who never was exposed to that, especially as a child, it's going to be harder.
Yes.
So, yeah, I don't know. In media, we tend to sort of group ourselves in terms of how we orient ourselves within media, what kind of music we like, what kind of films we like. That becomes a sort of a major identifier for us, right? So, and then we seek out others in that same kind of, with those same kind of markers. So yeah, tremendously impactful. Can be for good or for evil, I will say, right? That's a mixed bag.
She's making a very good point here. Media is very impactful to us, and for the last 60 to 70 years, media has been an important part of this personality appropriation and gender construction for us. Since the 50s at least, we start to get a new form of entertainment be feed to us 24 hours a day. So it is true that the modus operandi of the social norm will bleed into the media we consume these days, and they'll dictate what is appropriate and what not. So more representation. This normalization of more representation of different genders and sexualities in media are actually being more helpful, because we have more because we're diversifying our options for our personality appropriation and our gender construction at an early age. And we already utilize the things we hear or see in media as ways to to find our own identity and find the people that are from that community, and more or less find a place where we feel we belong. And then from that community we get other role models that we don't necessarily have access to in education or politics. So yeah, it is really impactful, and it can be both used for good and evil, as history has shown us, with the use of propaganda and other manipulative tools that are available in this media, in all medias. So yes, in a short period of time, it doesn't really change one's perspective, but in a long run, in a longer period of time, it actually starts to morph one's perspective and starts to build one's personality as they grow. Going with the impact media has in our construction of gender, I started to research about children media, like cartoons and whatnot, and I found an online article in the interviews I mispronounced his name. It's actually BG, as in Gatorade, BG Carter. That says something curious about the cancellation of one particular cartoon. I'll put a link down in the description with the cited works for this essay. But essentially what it said was that, according to the article, a major decision for cartoon content are toys, obviously, and apparently that also determines the gender of the demographic they try to sell to, which is boys. They try to sell toys to boys because according to the article, girls don't buy toys as much as boys. So most shows get cancelled when the majority of viewers are girls. Granted, this is something BG Carter took from interviews from two different creators that got their shows canceled, and he doesn't really use a statistic or any charts to prove if this is true or not, but it was a trend, and one of the creators mentioned this in one of the interviews. So what I asked when I brought this up to the people I interviewed, I asked, do you believe this statement? How true is this statement? And then I asked, why does toys have to be gender locked, and how does that affect gender construction? So basically, toys are another form of role models where children interact with these toys, and through play and through play they enact what they've seen or heard in media and start to accumulate more experience with one another. It's a way for children to share what they've learned so far from their personality appropriation between each other. So I asked some of the people I interviewed about this to give their opinions about this.
One of the hardest things as a parent who's critically engaged and who's at least trying to parent quite mindfully and in opposition of some of these strong categorizing sorts of institutional thoughts. It's like Prometheus pushing that rock up that mountain,
Mm-hmm.
you know? Is that him? Yeah. It's really fascinating and horrifying to see just how incredibly gendered toys are, and how in such well-engineered and well-marketed ways just tell children exactly what it means to be a girl or a boy. And it describes these qualities and these characteristics so young, before we even understand what they're doing. And it's kind of perverse, actually. It's kind of perverse, and it's really difficult to push against that current as a parent. Again, it is getting better because there are more parents out there who are like, this is fucked.
When I was a little girl, there was a lot of things that were for girls and for boys, that's true. But then in the middle, when my older kids and my nieces and nephews were children, it was a little bit more like everything for everybody. But I don't know why, now that with the little girls, it's extremely obvious, the separation. They separate the toys so much, and I don't understand. I hate that they do that. And I like that Star Wars, because I liked Star Wars. I was 13 years old and I liked Star Wars, and it was not a boy thing only. And then most of the Marvels and all that, it's boys thing, but now Star Wars is trying to bring it to the feminine side, to say it could be boy or girl, it doesn't matter. And I think that's important, and I don't like to hear that they cancel shows because only girls watch them.
How true do you think that statement is? Do you think it's a BS too?
I think so, because there are a lot of shows that the girls look at that I'm sure it's things that only girls, and they're still on air.
Like, it's kind of the same with the color, like blue is for boy and pink is for girl. And I don't feel like it should be like a toy for a girl and a toy for a boy, because a girl can go and grab a toys, like a boy's toys, and the boy could go and grab a doll, or like it's the same thing. They're just toys. I feel like it doesn't matter, like if it's like a gun or a baby, I feel it's the same.
I hope it's not a real gun.
No, a toy gun. But yeah, it will it won't affect of what like the boy plays with. Like if he's playing with a baby, it's like he just likes playing babies. He like maybe when he grow up he will be a pediatric, like a doctor for babies or something like that.
Patriation.
Patriation.
I don't think I'm saying the word right. Don't worry, I'm also having difficulties with English.
Okay. And girls can play with cars, and when they grow up, they could be mechanic, or they could be a I don't know, something else. It doesn't have to be with cars. Or I don't feel like it will. I feel like if the dad or the mom are like, no, you're a girl, you have to play with like Barbie or a baby, that I think that will affect the kid that's playing with that. It won't be the kid, because he's like he doesn't think like, oh, this is for a boy, this is for a girl. I feel like it's the parents that influence the kid of what they should choose or what they should play with.
Going in this direction of dwelling into children media, I revisited the first question I did for this section with Judith Butler about normalization of gender in TV and film, and does it really affect it or not. I revisited that and looked into children media, and I started to think about the recent cartoons that are coming out, which are challenging tropes and archetypes regarding gender roles. So I started to do the question, are these positive, could these be positive role models? What do you think about these cartoons that redefine what gender is to the level of comprehension of a child? Are these positive role models? As before, most of the people I interviewed did see them as positive role models. Some even went a little bit further with their answer and actually pointed out that it's not necessarily a new thing that's going on right now. For example,
I can't necessarily speak to like contemporary cartoons because it's not something that I have like kept in my kind of like Rolodex of references. It's not something that I've watched. But I feel like when I think of like kind of cartoons that like maybe predated and also were kind of booming when I was young and like still watching cartoons, I feel like there's lots of representation that is like maybe overlooked throughout history. Like if you look at like Bugs Bunny, for example, which is like way before I was ever even a thought. Like there's tons of representation of like Bugs Bunny is like a huge crossdresser and like always like impersonates women to like partially for comedy, but also partially like there's like a sex sells kind of thing that they use as like a trope. Yeah, and I feel like that kind of is something that's funny to look at, or like Rugrats is something that I grew up with, and then looking back as an adult and seeing references to things that are maybe necessarily like pretty big topics to bring up in a cartoon that was like coming out in the early 90s. Yeah, like some of the topics that they come up with, like there's like I've seen things on the internet of like one of the babies saying like boys can wear dresses, or like references to like, oh, like I'm gonna be this like toy's dad, and then like another character saying like, oh, like we could both be its dad, and like things like that, which are like very big topics that are being delivered to kids, like maybe subconsciously, because it's not necessarily something that they instantly would catch on to, but they definitely like see it and they understand it. Yeah, I don't necessarily know, I don't think I know enough about like something like Steven Universe. Like I know of its existence, but I haven't seen any of it, so I can't really speak to. So I've seen the characters, and I've seen images, like I've seen images on the internet, yeah. But I don't have any context of like actual action of the show.
Well, at this point, I had to explain to him the show a little bit, using as an example one of the episodes from the show where Steven basically dresses on drag, but the reactions are not the stereotypical reactions of rejection or comedic effect. It's just his way of expressing himself, and the people around him accept that, and they're like, "Oh, that's so Steven." So after explaining that to him, after giving him that context, he continued by saying,
Yeah, I feel like it's hard when it's because it's like a children's show, so like they're saying like, "Oh, that's so Steven," but then like if that is in like reality, like if like a child maybe expresses like gender in a different way, and you just go like, "Oh, like that's so like so and so, like that's so them," like I feel like it maybe doesn't necessarily like acknowledge the importance of like gender expression and the importance that that has as you progress your life. But I do think that it is like it's good that it's being shown in like children's media, and it's something that is like being made acceptable, so that maybe like a child who is experiencing those thoughts or those feelings won't be like so scared or so cautious to like express that. So I feel like there's like it's kind of like one of those things that's maybe impossible to have like a perfect solution to, but I do think that it's a positive representation, especially if it's something because it's on like television, like it's accessible.
pointing out that there were previous examples of representation in the 90s and 2000s before this current decade. Actually made me reflect on that fact that it's not this bombardment of representation of different gender and gender diversity is not necessarily new. It's not necessarily a new thing that's just going on now. It has been happening before. Reflecting on it, I started to think maybe the reason we're noticing it more now is that there's been a rise in gender diversity in the animation industry, whereas before, back in the 80s and 70s, the everyday people who aren't part of the animation industry thought of the industry as a male prominent industry where only men worked in animation. But in the 90s and especially now, there has been a rise in female representation in the industry, and the show I use in this question, its creator is actually a female animator, Rebecca Sugar, and that just solidifies this example. And of course she's gonna bring this gender diversity into it because there's a lack of proper representation in the animation industry. So I'm not saying this is necessarily what Rebecca Sugar intends to, but I think that using this by playing with gender roles in her show, she's opening up the doors for more gender diversity and representation in not just the cartoons but also in the animation industry. This was the final question of the interview, of all the interviews, and then I follow up with a final concluding question that was a few words from the people I've interviewed of what they hope for the future. I'm not gonna be putting the clips of those answers here because I feel they belong in the context of their own interviews. And if you want to hear more in depth, if you want to hear these interviews more in depth, you can follow the links at the bottom of the description, where I'm gonna be citing the works and putting the links of all the material I've used for this audio essay. With all that being said, I want to say that personality appropriation and gender construction is it's not a temporal thing. It's not a development aspect. It's not something that just happens when you're a child. It's something that is ever evolving and always constant throughout one's life. I personally believe I'm still doing this. I'm still constructing my own gender and personality and sexuality and all that by doing this personality appropriation, looking up for these role models in the industry I'm getting into, the animation industry, and also in other areas outside of animation. I keep a lookout for these role models, and I believe other people do keep a lookout for these other models, for these role models. This conclusion came to me at the end of every interview. I noticed that people still are, that these people I've interviewed are still constructing their personality even today. Maybe they have their gender already in their already clear in their head. Their sexuality is 100% set in stone, but their personality keeps evolving with each new knowledge that we absorb, and each new personality that we appropriate from role models. We keep evolving. We keep reconstructing over and over our personality, gender, and sexuality. Even if it's set in stone, maybe something makes us rethink and add to the scripture on the stone. And with that, we come to the end of my audio essay. Thank you very much for listening to this audio essay. For this audio essay was made for my course in art history, for Art History 320, Intro to Feminist Theory, instructed by Dainij Nadu. Sorry if I butchered your name. This was Eduardo Jaime Alonso Castrejón saying muchas gracias por escuchar. Thank you very much for listening, and hope you have a very good day, or week, or holiday. Thank you.